Thanks everyone for coming. My name is Stig Leschly. I'm the moderator today. I work at an organization called the Postsecondary Commission, which is a recently formed nonprofit, and we're trying to start a new college accreditor. It's a pleasure to be here. The topic today is a question. The question is, do we need a movement of new colleges in American higher education? It really is a question, and we'll spend the next 39 minutes on it. The best part of today are the four people sitting next to me, our panelists. They're fabulous. And I had plans to introduce them, and then I realized there's no way I'm gonna do it properly. And so I've given each of them 1 minute, which means they're gonna spend 2, introducing themselves and their organization. Scott, you're furthest away from me, so you get to start. Go ahead.
Scott Pulsipher, I'm the president of Western Governors University. The name of the university is actually its legacy. It was founded over 26 years ago by the governors of 19 Western states. One of the things I first like to point out, you should ask yourself the question is, why did governors of 19 states decide to form a private nonprofit university when they all had their public university systems? So that's the first question I put to you. We were founded very specifically to expand access to high quality education for many of the underserved or unserved populations of residents that exist in all those different states. It took us, I think, a good 2+ years to get the first student enrolled. I think 3 or so years later, we had our first graduate, which the founders would tell you they jokingly had to pay to graduate her. But that was also one of those funny things we'll talk about, is the cycle of trying to establish a new model of education, also getting accreditation, credibility, and regulatory approvals and things like that, that there's a real chicken and egg problem going on there. But if you fast forward now to where we are 26 years later, we currently have enrolled over 145,000 students. We'll serve over 200,000 students in an academic year. We'll graduate 45 to 50,000 students a year. We have over 310,000 graduate alumni now, and in our recent Gallup survey results from this year too, they continue to see increases in their economic mobility after graduation. They continue to see high rates of well-being, really high rates of employer satisfaction. They see really high rates of overall referral rates, and our NPS is, I think, 74 among our graduates. So I think we've seen a tremendous opportunity to show that there's a need for new models of higher education to help people change their lives for the better. So I've been with WGU now 7 years, and I'm just trying to hold on.
Thank you. Well, Scott is running the world's largest university, and I am now running the world's smallest university. My name is Pano Kanelos. I'm the founding president of the University of Austin, which is commonly known as UATX, which is a university being formed in Austin, Texas, a private nonprofit university. And we're trying to do exactly what Scott proposed. We're trying to create new models for higher education. Our model is based upon the idea that we need to synthesize a traditional liberal arts education with a culture of entrepreneurship, innovation, and leadership. And so we are very carefully crafting a curriculum, bringing those things together. The first 2 years of our program are largely what we call the Intellectual Foundations program, which is that liberal arts piece. But in years 3 and 4, students, rather than go into majors, become junior fellows at research centers and think tanks, following a kind of project-based learning style. And going through the whole 4-year process is what we call the Polaris Project, which is a grand moonshot entrepreneurial project that every single student designs and engages in. So we believe it's a time to build new institutions, to make the world a better place. And we want to create generations of graduates who are builders and innovators and entrepreneurs.
Hi, Shai Reshef, University of the People. We are a nonprofit, tuition-free, accredited American online university, opening the gates of higher education for all those who cannot do it otherwise, either because of the price, I guess you heard about the price of higher education in the US, but in other places there are capacity, there aren't enough universities, political reasons, cultural reasons, just mentioning women in Afghanistan or refugees, you will understand what I'm talking about. And for all these people, we use the internet in order to bring education to them, higher education. We have students who are coming from 200 countries. We have by now 125,000 students coming from 200 countries. 16,500 of them are refugees. Saying that, our largest population of students coming from the US, not enough. We think that there is much more room to grow and many more people in the US that need our services. But that's what we do, and we believe that higher education should be a basic right to all and not a privilege for a few. And that's what we are trying to correct. Being different and relying on volunteers, we have 37,000 volunteers who make the university possible and make us being able to be tuition free. At the same time, we are trying to still be part of the regular accreditation system.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Leila Makarechi. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Merit America. We are a nonprofit that's creating a new pathway to the middle class for low-wage workers. And while we are creating a non-college pathway, I do promise I come in peace today. Before I dive in, I just want to take a second to get to know the audience. Raise your hand if you have a college degree. All right, so most folks in the room, and if you don't, congrats, you clearly got the memo from Bill Gates and Steve Jobs on what it actually takes to succeed. I think we're hosting a panel later today on the Billionaire's Toolkit. Actually, okay, all joking aside, the fact is that college as it stands today is just not working for almost 90% of low-income people in our country. People like Janelle, who's one of our learners, she actually did enroll in college and she left with $40,000 of debt, but no degree. She's now working full-time, earning $30K, and struggling to provide for 6 children. So Merit America was designed for Janelle and the other 53 million adults in our country just like her. Hardworking, talented people, stuck in low-wage work, mostly without degrees. So people like Janelle typically have had 2 options to get ahead, right? She could go to school, or she could work her way up. College is just not working. It's not affordable. It's too costly, both in terms of time and money. And let's face it, there's not really a clear pathway from Uber driver to Uber corporate. So Merit America provides a third way, a pathway from low-wage work to skilled careers. We combine fast and flexible programming, and we're tailored to what employers need most. By providing online programming and pairing it with really intensive professional coaching, we ensure our learners succeed. In less than 5 years, we've trained almost 10,000 learners, and starting next year, we'll be reaching 10,000 learners annually. Studies from the University of Virginia and Bridgman have confirmed that we've driven $300 million in wage gains so far, and we have a clear line of sight to driving $1 billion in wage gains by 2025.
Thank you. I'll just digress for a second and thank Leila for coming. When we were putting this panel together, the first people we called were Leila and her co-leaders at Merit America, and they said, we're not a college. And I said, you sort of are a college. And I really appreciate you being here, Leila. So, you know, you have on the stage here a startup college run by Scott, formed about 20 years ago, licensed and accredited. Shai is enormous, licensed and accredited. Pano, unless I've lost track, I think you are licensed in state law, not accredited, but aspiring, correct?
Close to being licensed.
Okay, you're in the gauntlet, and Leila's just doing the work outside the boundary of formalized, accredited institutional higher ed. So we have the right spokespeople up here for this question about novel teams, novel designs, and entry. We've already covered all the issues on the panel in the opening lines here. So my job is just to try to corral you on some of what you put out on the table. And I think I'm gonna start with the very blue-collar, hard-nosed realities of trying to start under the dent of law, state licensure, accreditation, and actual college, Title IV enabled, approved in state law. It's the world in which Leila doesn't operate. And so she and Merit America and her friends can enroll students with the benefit of Title IV. At the same time, gentlemen, they don't incur the distortions that arrive with having to operate inside the legal apparatus of US higher ed. So that's the setup. So I think the question, and Scott, I'll go down to you again because you're past this now, but can you describe the good and the bad of the on-ramp into US higher education for a would-be college? And as you do, talk a bit about state licensure, accreditation, the regulatory realities of the credit hour, Title IV financial aid, and how creativity and innovation is supposed to survive that.
I'm trying to think of the good part. Let me do my best to actually give you some history of the things that actually had to occur for WGU to get to where it is now. There is no doubt that when you're trying to develop new methods and models and modalities of learning at a post-secondary level, with the expectation at the end of the day that that can actually be recognized federally and at a state level. There are so many structures and rules in place that effectively sustain the status quo. And it wasn't enough that we decided to utilize the internet, like Shai was also trying to do with that model. It's like it wasn't enough that we were totally trying to change the modality of learning from in-person to online entirely, by the way. We have no in-person instruction. But we also were changing the pedagogical model away from basically what were sacred cows in higher education, things like a credit hour, things like seat time, things like academic freedom, et cetera, that were effectively codified in law. And you had to now endeavor to try to convince these individuals that were trying to sustain that model that it was going to be okay, that WGU was going to do what it's going to do. And that meant that the governors, in one particular case, in fact, the lawyer, the attorney for these governors at the time is in the room, is like, they had to establish an interregional accrediting commission because WGU was the entire 19 Western states. And there were 4 different regional accreditors that were covering those states. And those different accreditors had to be brought together to say, this is what we're trying to do, this is the model we're trying to create, this is how we're going to serve these students, this is the programs we're going to have, and we need you to accredit this institution so we can establish some level of credibility that each of those states that we can also operate in. And I remember one particular story that's shared by the attorney Mike Goldstein, who's in the room, that talks about that they basically raised their concerns to the governor and said, we don't think we can do this. And then wisely, the 2 governors kind of, were sitting at the end of this table, like move their chairs aside, look at one another, and then they asked the accreditors, remind me again who funds you? And they started just putting a point on the fact that you are funded by all the institutions that already exist in our states. And that we actually have the autonomous authority over those different institutions, and that you are a service provider to us in our efforts to expand access to education that the residents of our states need. And so they kind of at least forced this argument and discussion around, like, you are there to serve our endeavor, we are not there to meet your rules. We're trying to figure out how you adapt to what we're trying to do. Now, there is one other thing that's notable to just share, I will say, is that when you also choose a modality of the internet, you also break one other rule, which is physical presence. And to be licensed as a provider of higher education in a state, you have to be authorized in every state. WGU has students in all 50 states. To go about trying to get authorization in all 50 states would have been a hill that was too large to climb. And so through a presence forum and through work that really happened at a federal level, there's something else that also came about, which is the National State Reciprocity Agreement, NC-SARA, that actually allowed institutions like WGU and every other online institution today that if you were authorized to operate in one state as a higher ed institution, you can now operate in all other states under the reciprocity agreement in all states but California. It's the only state you can't do it now. But there are things like this that had to happen that were shocking to someone like me who came from industry to say, why did we create all these rules when in fact the primary thing should be about whether or not these programs and models and methods and everything else fundamentally deliver value for the individual? Do they increase the persistence rates, completion rates? Do they also deliver value for the individual, meaning that they're pathways that lead to opportunity, the individuals are getting great outcomes? It's solving workforce gaps, it's solving talent needs for the employers. Those should be the questions that should be asked, rather than, do you look like everything that we've done for the last century? That was the challenge that these founding governors and really the founding president, Bob Mendenhall, had to deal with. And I'm grateful that they had to, that they bear those scars and not me. So.
Amazing. Friends, this is going to go really fast. So, Pano, I'm going to have you address this because you're in the oven, so to speak, right now. And then Shai and Leila, I'm going to address the next question to the two of you. So go ahead, Brian, if you could comment a bit on what Scott's bringing up. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the barriers to entry for new institutions of higher learning, whether you're going to be in person or online, are extraordinarily high. When we first started this project, I was told by everybody, I had been president at another college, St. John's in Annapolis, Maryland, which was 300 years old, so they didn't have to deal with these issues. Now, starting in a university, I was told, by all the people I seek counsel from and my mentors, that it would take us at least 10 years to get off the ground. I thought, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. How are we going to innovate? How are we going to create new institutions if it takes an entire decade to get running? So I said, we're going to do it in 3. We're going to launch in 3 years. That was fall of 21. We are going to have our first freshman class in fall of 24. Now, one of the problems or challenges, let's say, with that first class is that we will not yet be accredited. We will be going through the process of accreditation. Those of you who are familiar with accreditation know that you cannot be fully accredited until you actually graduate a class of students that's gone through the entire program. So think about that, the Gordian knot there. You have to attract students so that you could be accredited, but who's going to go to an unaccredited institution? So you have to be so clear about your mission and the value that you're offering students from the get-go that accreditation seems to them to be unnecessary. So part of our strategy up front is to attract, our sort of pioneering students who, as we put it, don't want to go to a university, but want to build a university. And so we're going to bring those first cohorts on board. They're going to go through our programs, get our education, but they also get to build their own alma mater. And so that's going to be part of our pitch. But the barriers to entry are extreme. And, I think, if you look at the fact that, in the state of Texas, which has been booming for decades, we are the first new private institution that's being authorized by the state of Texas since, I think, 1963. Just think about that. That's not because people haven't had ambitions to start new universities, but because the barriers have been too high.
I promise we're going to move on to lighter, sunnier topics within a minute. Thank you, too. I'll just add a statistic that has been seared in my head, which is 93% of 2- and 4-year college students in America attend an institution that is more than 50 years old. That's a fact. So that's a fact. There was, for a while, an uptick in new entry, and we'll come to some of the problems of that uptick. It was a movement of new entry around for-profit colleges, primarily back in the 80s. We'll get in a minute to what the regulatory overhang has to look like to admit colleges properly. But leave that aside for a minute. As a matter of fact, we're dealing with a corpus that has been around for a long time. And let's leave that topic behind and let's imagine it away for a minute and ask the motivating question, which is, what is the design gap? What is the design gap to fill And Leila and Shai, I'm going to start with you. And Leila, I want you to imagine yourself a college president. And again, you guys, Merit America is an extraordinary thing. I've lost count of how many students they're serving. They're a workforce organization. They're after the same human and the same core economic mobility outcome. You're not an institution of higher ed. But if you were, what is the one or two things that you would be adamant about designing into a new college? And we're going to run down the line on this question, all four of you, but try to elevate and curate out the salient design gap that you would fill. What is that thing that most needs to be introduced in the design of a college? Go ahead, Starla.
Yeah, really powerful stat. I thought it was over 40 years old, so I was going to start by saying there's nothing inherently wrong with being more than 40 years old, as our panel can testify.
Nor 50.
Or 50, true. I'm not there quite yet, but true. Okay, so three really important barriers we see to post-secondary education. Very simple ones. Time, accessibility, cost, right? For the 53 million people like Janelle, these are critical barriers. So I'm going to share really quickly what we're learning from our learners and how we're trying to address each of these. Time. People who are struggling to pay rent right now just aren't looking for an option that takes years to deliver a result. So if you're working, doing a BA part-time can take 6 to 8 years. If you go through a program like Merit America, you could earn an industry-recognized certificate in 14 weeks or less. So this is really just the barriers we see for our learners who are working adults stuck in low-wage work. Second, accessibility. Adult learners are busy, right? They have jobs, they have families to provide for, and that's why we think really critically about the right mix of what to offer synchronously versus asynchronously. All of our training is online, all of it is part-time, and we wrap around really intensive coaching, professional coaching, to ensure that learners are successful. And third, cost. The vast majority of our learners have actually been to some college, but like Janelle, they leave with debt and no degree. And so they're unwilling to spend money on something without knowing, is this going to have a tangible impact for me and my family? So Merit offers an outcome-based loan product, which allows learners to access our training with no money up front. And if they're successful and earn above a salary threshold, they repay a fixed low monthly fee that covers a portion of our cost to train.
I know you're not a college, but you sound like a college. Okay, go ahead, Shai. Yeah, so again, look, try to prioritize a design feature that you think is most important, as they just did, so we can just try to acquire a sense from you where the gap is. If we could get the right teams in, where would the designs head? That's the question. Go ahead, Shai.
Well, I'll start by saying that the American higher education is the best in the world. The entire world is looking at the American higher education. So there are some good things about it. The problem is that it doesn't change, and every stakeholder has the interest to preserve the system. Thinking about the cost of higher education in the US doesn't make any sense. No country in the world charges so much money, and part of the reason that the cost is so high is the regulations, what universities need to put in place in order to be accredited. And the entire process is extremely costly. Now, being accredited, and we are accredited nationally, and we are now pursuing a regional accreditation by WASC, and we have to invest a lot in order to meet the standards. Now, to some extent, it's great. I mean, it forces us to become better, it forces us to have policies that are important for the students. Other things that we have to do, we do for the accreditation, not for the students, and it costs money. And eventually, the students pay for it. So I think that the cost is extremely important. Second is being open to change. I can say three things that is a challenge for higher education. Well, I talked about the cost, but volunteers, we based on volunteers. We have 37,000 volunteers. Well, this is something that is really, really hard for the system to absorb. How can you make a university by volunteers? Another thing will be our pedagogy of peer-to-peer learning, where students teach and learn from each other. Now, I think that the question is, how open is the system or the systems to look at different modalities and check the outcome rather than checking the process? Because accreditation is mainly about process, not about outcome. And I think that outcome should be the only thing that matters. Show that you teach the students, show that they get a job, show that you actually give them a better future. That's the only thing that eventually should be important.
Can I just add to your design question?
Of course you can. Yeah, and Pano, you're both invited to respond to this one. Right, yeah.
Well, I think the design question actually got lost in U.S. higher education, because I think it is true. It's like, it's really good. However, when I say it got lost is that I think fundamentally as a society, whether you go back to the Morrill Act in 1862 or to the Higher Ed Act in 1965 or everything else, the general belief is that if you can dramatically expand access to the acquisition of a knowledge, skill, and ability at an individual level, that will activate individuals into the economy and into society and into the workforce in a way that nothing else will. However, the institutions that then started being the primary entities that were advancing that design principle started being succumbing to mission creep, scope creep, operational creep in ways that they lost that core function of how do you fundamentally enable individuals to access the acquisition of knowledge, skill, and ability. That's how I define education, the acquisition of knowledge, skill, and ability. It's those things I need to change my life for the better. And when I say institutions lost their purpose, that at some point here we realized that what we've actually designed is a life experience that you want to fund masquerading as education. Because if you even look at the pandemic and the amount of money that the federal government actually granted the institution, it was for revenue lost not from tuition, but from many other sources of things that they were doing so that individuals could acquire education, but by themselves became a part of this wholly integrated value proposition that's really hard to sustain. And it's so hard to sustain that the only people now able to participate in it are the privileged. I've said this in House hearing that I was a part of. I've written about this too, that if you look at the top 25% of income quartile in the US in the last 50 years, attainment rates have gone from roughly low 40s to now upper 60s. But if you take that same 25%, for example, that Leila's talking about, they're at the bottom income quartile of households, attainment's gone from 6% to 13%. It is not working for all of us. And I think that was the design principle that at least WGU had at its core. I hear some of the other things that are at the core, which is education is supposed to be a great equalizer, but it's not working that way currently because of all these barriers around affordability, around accessibility, around time commitments, around relevancy to work. And so I think of our design principles like that's probably our three core things, like the quality and relevancy of the learning, the student experience so it can dramatically increase the probability that every student succeeds, and third, what is the affordability and the cost such that you have a really high ROI?
Let me jump in there as well about design flaws. Universities and colleges have essentially become 120 credit delivery systems. Why? Why is the gold standard for undergraduate education this 4-year degree in most cases, and that's where we allot 120 credit hours to, even though there's such a range of things that people are pursuing under the aegis of that degree? I mean, when you think about graduate programs, there's a reason that a law program is 3 years and a medical program is longer depending upon specialty, because you've identified what knowledge, skills, and abilities one needs to acquire during that period and shape it in an efficient way. Why does every undergraduate degree have to conform to the same credit hour model? You can imagine some majors that should be shorter, some that might be longer, depending upon what it is that you're trying to achieve. Yet that system is totally inflexible, at least right now, and again, sort of protected by the accreditation industrial complex. that has decided that certain things are unassailable because institutions that already operate according to those principles have too much at stake?
Great. I'm going to ask you a cousin question to the design question, which is the team and the resourcing question. So stipulate for a minute that the barriers can be managed, and stipulate for a minute that a new college has a convincing design. So that's not hard to believe just listening to you for 5 minutes. I want to ask you the next question, which is, to form a college, can you talk about, you're each living this, you're not building a college, Leila, but you're acquiring resources, you're raising money, you're hiring people, and each of the three of you are in that work. And can you just comment a bit about, and maybe Shai and Pano, I'll start with the two of you, about what you're living through to resource, meaning quite literally acquire people, acquire capital, acquire knowledge to try to form one of these and try to size that problem a bit. Because if we're to believe in new entry, we not only have to believe in the availability of new designs, we also subsequently have to believe that organizations can form and acquire the people and the capital they need. So comment a bit about the realities of that. I'll start with the two of you in the middle.
I think that starting a new institution, it's like starting any other new organization, is hard, and you need the capital. In our case, it was slightly different, so I'm not sure that I'm the person to answer fully your question, because we are tuition free and because we have a mission to open the gates of higher education for every qualified student, a lot of people came on board to help us. I announced the program actually in Munich in January 2009. The next day there was an article in the New York Times about it, and the following day I already had hundreds of professors writing an email and said, wow, we love the idea, we want to help making it happen. They made it happen. And so the amount of resources that we need was minimal. Since then until now, we are heavily lean on volunteers, people who are willing to give their time, knowledge, expertise in order to make it happen. So we are actually have a fraction. It cost us a fraction of the cost of a normal university. We run a university with 125,000 students on a budget of slightly more than $20 million. I'm sure that all of you understand how little it is. But I think that, when we once qualified how much we would have needed in order to make it happen, you should add zeros, many zeros to our numbers. So, but I'm not sure that I can give a full answer to that. Yeah.
I think Pano can add a few zeros to your numbers. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in-person institutions have so many built-in costs. But I will say that one of the reasons we need new institutions is because in forming and shaping a new institution, because in most cases you have scarcity of resources, you're really compelled to question some of the underlying assumptions about how universities should run. So you guys have heard these statistics, some version of them. Right now, Harvard University has about 16,000 total students, 15,800 administrators, and only 2,300 faculty. Think about that for a moment. I mean, who's paying for that? So if you're building a new university and you want to be affordable and accessible and provide a high quality education like the one we're going to provide, how do you start off being lean and mean? And you start to question, well, what does an administrator do? What's the purpose of the services we're providing? What is that wraparound lifestyle that we're offering students? What should be jettisoned from that? And what we're finding is that the economic pressure of starting a university helps you make the right choices for the long run and committing that. It still does take a lot of money. And I think thankfully, we're finding the resources coming in at a steady clip. But it is, what we hope to do when we launch is show that you can run, a relatively traditional university at a fraction of the cost of the way that universities are run today, and that the kind of war of attrition that we see at most universities is not just excessive, but unethical.
One thing I heard from the panel that I just want to really emphasize is the funding mechanisms. Even though we're not a college, we're not a college. If someone wants to give us Pell Grant eligibility, I'd love to chat, but we're not a college. I think the funding mechanisms that are input-based instead of outcomes-based, and for all of us, I think that that's a really important component. So instead of making funding decisions based on how many hours something takes, which doesn't have a clear impact on someone's life, if we could switch to making funding decisions, whether it's public dollars or not, based on jobs attained or wage gains driven or cost to serve, I think it could help all of our models, whether you're college or a different pathway. And sort of inherent within that, a battle we've been fighting is giving programs access to administrative wage data, right? So we're working with the state of Texas and the Department of Labor to do a longitudinal study of our alumni and measure their wages over time. But it's taken us years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get access to that data, which feels like it should just be table stakes for providers and frankly for learners too, to see if I go to this institution, what is the impact I can expect in terms of my life, my employability, and the wages I can earn. And then the last point, just on the resourcing question, I think it is a really interesting time to think about more innovative and scalable financing for post-secondary education. So if we all agree that one goal we share is people, regardless of if you're in the top percentage or the bottom percentage socioeconomically, one goal of post-secondary education is that people can realize their dreams, they can provide for their families, they can access a career with family-sustaining wages, then I think financing also has to be learner-friendly and scalable. So one initiative I'll just share is that we helped design with Google the Google Career Certificate Fund, which allows learners to access programs like Merit, again, with no payment up front, and then repay a 0% loan if they're earning above a salary threshold at a fixed low monthly rate. So if we could get public dollars or creative private financing mechanisms in a way that's scalable and learner-friendly, I think all of our institutions could benefit regardless of if we're a college or not.
Yeah. And you've opened us up in a way, Leila, to another 5 panels, which is the actual question of measuring value-added earnings gains as, among many outcomes in higher ed, arguably the central one or the minimal one. Scott, we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to give you the last word. I have to do one quick administrative thing before I let Scott close us out, which is if you're interested, please click on that code, that funny-looking thing up there. It will take you to a survey that the Koch Foundation is running. They're interested in interacting with alternative providers of higher ed and to gather information about them. And you can find that survey, if it's of interest to you, behind that barcode, RF, what's it called? I don't even know, whatever that thing is. QR code, yes. I'm definitely over 40. Okay, Scott, you have the last 1.5 minutes. I'm gonna ask you a very narrow question, and then I'm gonna ask you a broad one. First of all, on this question of resourcing, can you just quickly remind the audience of the amount of capital, roughly speaking, that was required early on to get WGU off the ground? It's sort of a, what's the quick answer to that, Scott, just to round out?
About 50 million.
50 million.
Before we got to self-sustaining.
Got it, all right, so you had a small army of governors and $50 million to get you through. That's the
governors didn't give us 50 million, but
Yeah,
we
no,
did have to raise probably 45 million.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. It's somehow both manageable and also intimidating. The last question, Scott, is this, which is to round us out. If you had to imagine a regulatory and legal scheme that can enable new entry in a reasonable, carefully regulated way, what is the one or two things that you would implement if you were in charge of the country for a day?
Oh man, I think I would try to actually create an environment where you had greater transparency about value-based outcomes. Or, are the products and services that are being advanced, how do they actually communicate value to the actual individuals to be served in this case? I think the regulatory model has probably gotten in the way of what I would consider normal economic forces, market forces that says the individuals are able to make good choices about how they're going to invest their money to try to advance their lives. The other thing I would say is that you can have a mechanism by which you have a really good trial period of things that just allows for innovation to occur. Coming from the industry, coming from venture-backed entities, there is this period by which venture has to occur so that disruptions, of all the disruptions, that you can actually identify the things that actually work. And if you have to force all those disruptions to look like the things they already do, you'll never create an environment by which innovation can continue to operate at scale. And so there can be means by which you have effectively trial periods, that they have all the kind of full weight of federal regulatory, Title IV eligibility if you need it. You have the support of accreditors to say, but we're holding those things accountable to the outcomes and the impact for the students that are going to be served, and we're going to hold them accountable to proving that. That is how venture-backed entities actually work. Only those things that are delivering value survive, and I think we need to have a mechanism to do the same in higher ed.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. Thank you all. It's a wrap. Thank you for doing this. Bye.
Thank you.